Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The Solomon Islands has been the subject of intense focus since it was revealed in March that the Pacific nation is in the process of formalizing a security arrangement with China. Some countries fear the security agreement paves the way for China to deploy troops and build a military base on the islands. Both China and the Solomon Islands have denied the speculation, but this has fallen on deaf ears. What exactly does the security pact entail? Why are countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and the US so concerned about it? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined by Lucy Niu, Executive Director of the Research Center for Pacific Studies of Beijing Foreign Studies University, Rick Dunham, former White House correspondent for Business Week, Digby Wren, a political analyst and international relations scholar from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the show. I will start with Lucy. Since last month, the Solomon Islands has received a lot of global attention. Give us some background information. What is it all about?
Yeah, I think all this China Solomon Island Security Pact is because the last year a riot occurred in the Solomon Island, and it's most damaged those persons and properties. Chinese there. You can see Chinese Chinatown and some of the Chinese investment project were damaged. So this security pact mostly in order for protect further Chinese there and also Chinese investment project.
So, Digby, it's if you look at the report, mostly it's about legal cooperation and in terms of law, I guess enforcement and also police, for example, targeting the violence, public security. There is a need, obviously, as Lucy said, for the Chinese side to protect the Chinese investor or Chinese business over there. But also, do you see there's also an interest from Solomon Islands side, for example, at least it's drawing attention of Australia, of the United States, of New Zealand, probably to pay more attention to their need?
Well, of course, the first thing is that the aid from Australia, which is quite large actually, but it's not balanced with any kind of defence or security, specifically in terms of police, local security. So it's out of balance in terms of budget. Very little money is spent on that, and as Lucy Niu just said, I mean, with the riots that happened last year, and it was a very great problem for the Chinese businesses and investments in the country, and obviously the police and the local security forces are not equipped to be able to handle this. They're not equipped materially and they're not trained properly. And so this is just a step forward to setting up a framework to enable that to happen as we go forward. But it doesn't really respond to the internal divisions in the country because of the way, it's really a country of many islands in many ways. And so it doesn't respond to that, but it does allow to create a framework where the police are going to be able to receive material support, training support, and logistics support. And that is a step forward, actually.
Well, Mahon, obviously, New Zealand, along with Australia, also expressed a concern about probably more Chinese presence here. So what is the concern about, from Australian official and also sometimes a commentator? They talked about, this is our backyards, this is our neighborhood, this is basically our sphere of influence. So basically, the Chinese presence is not really welcome. Is that the case?
Well, the responses from Canberra and Wellington were unfortunate in a sense, because the first issue here is what are the interests of the Solomon Islands? And the Solomon Islands have requested China to undertake this agreement. And it is to protect Chinese interests, but also both New Zealand and Australia have deployed police forces, peacekeeping forces over recent years because of deep divisions within Solomon Island society. So they have a major internal security issue, and they have the right to choose who they wish to come in and try and mediate and mitigate the issues. So to refer to the Solomon Islands or the Pacific at all as Australia or New Zealand's backyard has a strange colonial tinge to it. Both countries are major aid providers to the Pacific, but so is China. For over a decade now, China's been a major supporter of the Samoa, of Tonga. So this actually is nothing new in some ways, but it has the context of the present American discomfort with China. And unfortunately, New Zealand doesn't normally echo that view, but it did in its response in this case. But in the end, it won't matter because China will do what it does, and I'm sure that the fears that people have won't actually be realized. This is about Solomon Islands trying to create domestic stability.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rick, some would say this is also, in a way, part of the China-U.S. issue, because China a rising power, the U.S. established the power. Obviously, the U.S. has a secured interest in this region traditionally. Let's use the word like a sphere of influence. So that's why you see a very senior official from the White House, basically Asian Affairs Coordinator, on his way to Solomon Islands. So what's the fear? What's the concern from Washington? Let's say.
Well, I mean, the concern from Washington would be for a worst-case scenario, which would be China eventually establishing military bases and weaponry and possibly weaponizing that part of Micronesia and that part of the South Pacific. There's no evidence of that, and that's sort of speculation of the people who are most fearful. But I would say overall, the United States is guilty to some degree of diplomatic malpractice here for ignoring the Solomon Islands for a very long time, not having full-scale embassy or ambassador in place. And now all of a sudden, with China paying a lot of attention, the United States is perking up its ears and at least is trying to figure out what's going on.
So, could be Solomon Islands, they are playing all the big powers, So the U.S., realized like we need to play some catch up, as reported, like for more than 20 plus years, the U.S. is going to have a new embassy in Solomon Islands. Is that right?
I agree with you there. I think the United States is playing catch up. Also, if you are the Solomon Islands, and there are issues of both economic difficulties and corruption, why not play off major powers? I mean, Australia is the most important economic relationship for the Solomon Islands, but why not play off Australia, New Zealand, China, and the U.S. and see what you can get? And if you get some security, domestic security and security for your government, I can see why the Solomon Islands government would have reached out to China. I see why China would do it, both in terms of the Chinese businesses, Chinese economic interests, and geopolitical interests. So this is what happens in the world. Little countries in potentially important places make moves, and the superpowers respond. And that's what I think that's what we're seeing. But it's really in slow motion. I mean, this is not a global crisis, but it's very interesting for those of us who watch the international relations to watch it play out, and we don't know where it's going, but it could be very important down the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, Lucy, tell us, what's the Chinese, purpose of this plan, to have this security agreement? As you said, of course, besides this protecting the Chinese interests over there, because if you look at the history of this country, there are several riots, in different times. Obviously, there's a need, I guess. They will get, aid from, security aid assistance from China, from Australia, from New Zealand, probably from every country they can. But long term, or in terms of geopolitical interests, is there a geopolitical interest for China?
Well, the security pact, the particular contents is very clear, stays there. Says only for the Solomon Island national internal security matters, protections, and you can see the those contents is only cover some humanitarian materials and some politics materials. I think all these issues is overreacted by America, Australia, and New Zealand. Yeah, we have to say that.
Yes, according to the leaked draft, it's mostly about, Digby here is about disaster relief, about humanitarian assistance. And also, it includes the Chinese ship. Maybe they will dock, they will visit, they will stop over, replenishment, for example. Of course, at the request or with agreement from the Solomon government over there. Some would say this is very similar to the security agreement with the one they have with Australia.
Yes, as the Solomon Island.
Okay, Lucy, yeah. Go ahead.
As the Solomon Island government said, all these security pact, the arrangement similar with any other countries. They said they want to be friend to everybody, but not with any one of the enemy. So all the security agreement is the same and equal to every other countries.
Mm-hmm. Digby, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say that what Lucy just said, actually, that is that this is a very soft kind of arrangement that's not unusual at all. There's many kinds of security arrangements like this between Australia and some of the islands, between the US and some other islands and countries. This is not an unusual arrangement in any way. It's very low key, very soft. I mean, we're not talking about major military arrangements, and it's not unusual, of course, for ships to visit. We're not talking about very large ships here. We're talking about relatively small ships. Even if they are naval, they're relatively small. But it's important to realize that the thing that is most interesting for the Solomon Islands is economic development. I mean, this is what the island really wants. And for example, Australia has upped their budget for the Solomon Islands, but they're building a $60 million Australian High Commission. When the Solomon Islands has just had their major hospital partially destroyed due to floods. Now, this is more, and that money will be spent, on Australians building the new facility, but the hospital is not being upgraded or restored or repaired, and that would be much more important. And this is the kind of mishandling that's going on the ground. You see, I mean, Australia would look very good if it was saying, well, hang on, we'll spend the money and upgrade this hospital immediately. But that's not what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And I think China has been much more focused on the economic development and climate change. And I think above all, the islands are really worried about climate change.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's true. They are not happy with Australia, being not doing enough, let's say, in terms of fighting climate change. And understandably, they will welcome, and also like Chinese BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, like maritime, Belt and Road Initiative.
Right.
Yeah, would bring more investment.
Yeah, the exports for these islands are exports that China can consume really well. I mean, sort of fish, processing of fish and other things that the islands produce. I mean, they're not, they don't produce minerals. So it's basically agriculture or aquaculture and those sorts of things. Well, Australia basically doesn't import those things, but China can and wants to. And so they want to develop the supply chains with the islands. And that means that, you've got to have better ports, you've got to have inter-island trade as well, and they need upgraded, all sorts of facilities upgraded. And so China has concentrated on that. And this is, I think, the biggest problem with the US and the Australians, not so much New Zealand, where they haven't concentrated on this at all.
Mm-hmm. Well, Mahon, interestingly, we mentioned about whether China is going to build a military base in this region. Australia would say that's our backyard. You should not have a military base from China. It reminds me of this ongoing Ukraine crisis. I think Solomon Islands is about 2,000 miles away or kilometers away from Australia. But look, if that's the reason you can say no to China's engagement with Solomon Islands, I mean, probably Russia has every reason to attack Ukraine because that's the immediate neighbor, remember, NATO eastward expansion. Is that, and also, even there's a military base, let's say, China is surrounded with military bases, mostly US military bases like in Japan, in South Korea, Southeast Asian nations. I mean, China is not saying that, US should remove your military bases from my neighborhood or my backyards. So, is there any way, somehow we can basically to reduce this tension it seems to me like there's a lack of trust, mostly politically, such as like relationship between China and Australia over the past years, obviously is on the, basically down the hill, and so maybe that contributes somewhat to this tension.
I think it's at the heart of Australia's concerns. I don't think the parallel with Ukraine is actually accurate. Ukraine is a sovereign country. China recognized that 30 years ago. Russia invaded. So whatever the causes that led up to it, the act was an invasion. And this is not an invasion. This is an island nation that's requested China to help it, seeing that China can give more than the countries that have traditionally aided it, being to quite an extent Australia, although the Morrison government cut its aid to the Pacific severely, well into its first year or so, I think. So, and certainly to the Solomons, the amount of aid is reduced considerably. So they don't have much choice. They're looking after their interests. When it comes to military concerns, at this stage, I don't think there are military concerns. China has not tried to build military bases in other island nations in the Pacific, or even suggested it. And yes, there's over 70 American bases in the Pacific region. So it's not a military issue. However, as long as other nations talk about that and make parallels to missiles in Cuba, it begins to push both the Solomons and China into a difficult position. Mm-hmm. So I think those countries that feel uncomfortable with this have to be careful of their language. But also I think it's incumbent upon China to make a real effort in this region to demonstrate what it is doing and what its motives are. And whatever Canberra or Wellington says, or Washington, China needs to just be true to its own initial motivation and say, these are our aims, and demonstrate what they're doing, over-explain sometimes. And then I think as time moves on, this will be quickly forgotten. Mm-hmm. There are far more critical strategic issues of the world to actually worry about.
Yes, Rick, I think Mahon mentioned a very good point. That is like, on China's side, probably China need to demonstrate to the regional countries, including Australia and New Zealand, that China does not have ill intention, to militarize this region or to create tension in this region. For example, there's a logistic support base in Djibouti. Some say, oh, that's Chinese first military base in Djibouti. That's mostly about fighting the piracy, fighting these problems over there, protecting the convoys. So far, we have seen is like it's just like other countries. China is acting, and nothing China has done, let's say, negatively to the regional stability and peace over there, Rick.
Well, I think some of the extreme rhetoric comparing this to being Australia's Cuban Missile Crisis is really irresponsible. The Cuban Missile Crisis, you had not just Russian troops in Cuba, but you had nuclear missiles that could have struck New York. I mean, we're talking about a security pact, and even if you think that there are long-term negative implications for security of Australia, I mean, it's really premature and irresponsible to say that this is some sort of imminent military crisis. I mean, China always thinks the long game in terms of its own security, and the economics is more short-term here. I think we just have to see this play out. I just want to make one small point, which is for the United States, if you asked an American, what about the Solomon Islands, I don't think people would know what it is. But if you mention the word Guadalcanal, all of a sudden you would be ripping a sore off an old scab, because tens of thousands of Americans died there in a months-long battle in what's now the Solomon Islands in the war with Japan. It was a turning point of American military getting offensive instead of playing defense against the Empire of Japan. So I do think that there are some thoughts of the United States of the overall potential significance of the Solomon Islands down the road, but I think it's really premature. We're talking about a small agreement right now. We're not talking about nuclear missiles that are aimed at any other country. Mm-hmm.
Well, Digby, do you think there's overreaction? When, in particular, when some commentators said that Australia should invade Solomon Islands and change the government because this is like a Cuban Missile style crisis at the front door of Australia.
Well, I think there's an election in Australia in May, And the stated objective or stated election campaign of the Morrison government has been national security. And so, because in every other area, basically, the Australian electorate has not been happy with that government, and they're falling behind in the polls, and they decided early on, so let's say a few months ago, that they were going to use national security as their main campaign. And so this plays into that. They want to highlight this. They want to, be, as another commentator just said, it's slightly irresponsible to talk about it in terms of nuclear missiles and things like that. It's nothing like that. That's one reason. The other reason is, of course, there is Australia's security is basically there's a northern arc, if you like, from the northeast all the way around to the northwest of Australia, and that is a legitimate concern. But I think what's happening here is the approach is very different. It's an exclusionary approach, as in it's either us or it can't be anybody else. And I think it's China, on the other hand, likes to have a much more, shall we say, bilateral, trilateral, multilateral approach where everybody's involved and it can be agreed upon. That the thing that's most important is political security for the islands, economic security for the islands, and that everybody should participate in that. And the ambassador in Australia, the Chinese ambassador, has mentioned this on numerous occasions, but was told point blank that Australia wasn't interested in talking about the Solomon Islands.
Mm-hmm. Well, it often makes me think about, sometimes Australian naval ships would go to, say, South China Sea. That's not about another country, right? That's really about China. So right. China would see, that's not really a threat, but also annoyance, in terms of challenging China, claims, the disputes between China and neighboring countries. But really, it has very little to do with Australia. Remember, it's a very different situation over there.
Yes, I think that's true. But look, the importance of the Solomon Islands to the United States is very evident in the fact that Kurt Campbell, the Undersecretary for East Asia, is going to go to the Solomon Islands. That's highly unusual. So that shows you. So what are they going to do? What are they going to offer the Solomon Islands? I think last time that there was problems a few years ago, the Americans put a lot of money into Milita, and Milita were the ones that were not happy about the Taiwan decision, and at least partially responsible for the riots, which has led to this situation, right? Mm-hmm. So I think he may come with a pocketbook and want to be financing more divisions in the islands if they can't get anything else, mm-hmm. And I think that could be a negative step.
But could it be, let's say, more instability in that islands over there?
Exactly, more instability, and that's not good.
Yeah, so that we'll come back and on that point. But let's focus a little bit more, Lucy, on the Chinese long-term interest. China has tried to explain that we are not seeking global hegemony because China is a rising power. There's a understandable, I would say, concern and anxiety on the side of the U.S. or on the side of Australia, or neighboring countries. So China needs probably to use patience to explain and to demonstrate it's not going to do anything harm to those nations there. But for China, I think among the P5, permanent 5 of this UN Security Council, China is the only country that is yet to achieve national reunification or territorial integrity. I don't think China is somehow aims a far place like in Solomon Islands to set up a new military base and to threaten Australia or US or New Zealand. So what's your understanding of this move, in particular with probably Belt and Road Initiative? Lucy, yeah.
Oh yeah. Actually, these agreements signed is just a draft agreement, and people already overreaction. Then China already, we have speakers from Foreign Affairs already explained many times, but outside just don't believe that. I think for security. For the security and even military cooperation, before China with any other Pacific Island countries like Fiji, Tonga, or other Pacific Island countries, it is very normal and no any reaction like such. Even myself, I don't know why so overreaction. Actually, for China and Pacific Island cooperation in way of major in the economic cooperation, not in any other ways. China already have a diplomatic relations with Pacific Island countries since 1970s, almost 40 years. So you can't see China build up or raise up any military power in the Pacific region, and China doesn't want to bring any, any dangers actually to the Pacific Island countries. And on the other hand, Pacific Island countries, they don't want to involve any geopolitics. That's the major point.
Mm-hmm. A very interesting point over there. So Mahon, obviously, for China, there's also diplomatic consideration, or diplomatic. It's almost like a race, between the mainland and Taiwan in terms of recognition. Which side represents the so-called one China over there. So Solomon Islands, 2019, switched the recognition from Taiwan to the mainland, and before that, I think Kiribati. So there's a obviously economic interests and also diplomatic interests over there. Can we see that?
I think so, and we can't ignore the strategic perceptions of everyone involved. I mean, America has been the hegemonic power, the single power since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And although it's taken little interest in the South Pacific, its presence, of course, with its core in Hawaii has been considerable. So when you look at the way that the world is changing, there's going to be reactions to anything China does. The fading empire, the dying empire of the US, not that it'll go suddenly, but its political and its clout globally is fading. There's great insecurity, and that gives a context to any of these actions that China takes. So I think China's not surprised in some ways at the responses, because it's seen in a context which doesn't have anything to do with the Solomons. It's simply the jostling of two powers now, which is America that doesn't want to lose something, and China that America misunderstands is out there to take away what America has. China only wants to become strong and safe and to become as economically powerful as it can. So I think the challenge is to actually, as Digby said, to invest in a real way into the Solomons, but also really understand the social and political dynamics, because if China doesn't do that, the domestic fissures, the domestic discord that's been characterizing the Solomons for so long will give them a real handful. And the Chinese police, People's Armed Police, will have a lot more to deal with than they probably want. So one thing they must get right is the politics. I'm not saying they won't, but I think if China can just stop worrying, and I'm sure it's not worrying too much what others are saying, and they'll focus on bringing as much balance as they can to that society.
Mm-hmm. So Digby, 30 seconds, what's the way to go for China, for example, to reduce the tension and to work together probably, not only with Solomon Islands, and probably to reach out to Australia and the US and New Zealand, for example?
That's definitely the way to go. Keep this draft agreement very low key. Ensure that it's run as smoothly as possible in a low-key manner. Concentrate on economics. Concentrate on development of the local economy and climate change, and keep making openings, if you like, to the Australians and to its other trading partners, China's trading partners in the region, to cooperate in the development of the islands.
Over there. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks again to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.